6 years ago, Claire Novak died. Not in any way that made the news. Not in any way that left a coffin or a flag or a folded letter in someone's mailbox. She died the way certain people die when the government decides it is cleaner, tidier, and considerably safer for everyone involved if they simply stop existing on paper. She signed the document herself, pressed her thumb to the biometric pad, watched the screen confirm what she already knew. And then she walked out of a building in Northern Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2019, got into a rented sedan and drove west until the skyline of Washington disappeared in her rearview mirror. She did not look back. She told herself that was strength. For a long time, she almost believed it. Tonight, at 37,000 feet above the American heartland, someone just used her dead name to wake up a plane full of sleeping people. And Claire Novak, sitting in seat 9A of Flight 717, still has not decided whether that is a rescue or a sentence. The morning had been ordinary in every way that mattered. Denver in November does not apologize for itself. The cold comes in from the mountains like it owns the place, and the sky above Denver International sits low and gray, the color of old concrete, the color of patience worn thin. Claire had arrived at the airport 90 minutes early, not because she was anxious. She was never anxious anymore, or at least that was what she had learned to tell herself. She arrived early because she liked to watch the room before she entered it. Old habits do not die. They go quiet. They wait. She wore jeans broken in at both knees, a soft blue hood down, a pair of earbuds that were not connected to anything. She carried a single carry-on bag, slim and unassuming, the kind that fits in the overhead bin without negotiation. She bought a bottle of water at the terminal newsstand and a paperback novel from the rack beside the register, chosen not for its story but for its size, something that fit in one hand, something to hold. The book was a thriller. She found that quietly funny. She had read the same page 11 times in 6 years. Page 47. The page where the protagonist realizes too late that the person she trusted most was the one who had been watching her all along. Claire had stopped reading there the first time and never gone further. She was not sure if that was wisdom or cowardice. On most days, she suspected it was both. She found her seat. Row 9, seat A, window. She tucked the carry-on under the seat in front of her, not overhead. She liked knowing where her hands were and where her bag was at all times. She pressed her back against the seat cushion and let her eyes move slowly through the cabin. 186 passengers on Flight 717, Denver to Chicago, nonstop. A morning flight carrying the usual mixture of people. That morning flights carry families with children who had already surrendered to exhaustion. Business travelers with the hollow look of men and women who had taken this route so many times the journey had become invisible to them. A few college students distributed throughout economy like punctuation marks, young and loud and already wearing headphones before the doors had closed. Claire cataloged them the way she always cataloged rooms. Not obsessively, not with fear, just with the steady automatic attention of someone who had spent 15 years being paid to notice things that other people missed. Exits, sightlines, hands, eyes. The way a person holds their shoulders when they think no one is watching. The way a person breathes. Nothing on Flight 717 raised anything. No flags, no tells, no one watching her, no one watching anyone in particular. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked out the window as the plane pushed back from the gate. Maybe this one really was just a flight. Inside the cockpit, a different morning was underway. Captain Brett Calloway had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years. He had accumulated more than 18,000 hours in the air. He had flown through weather systems that would have broken younger men, navigated mechanical failures with a calm that his co-pilots consistently described as eerie, and once landed a wide-body jet at O'Hare on one functioning hydraulic system and a runway that had not been fully cleared of ice. He was not a man who startled easily. The alert that appeared on the secondary display screen at 6:14 in the morning, 41 minutes after takeoff, startled him. His co-pilot Hartfield had seen it first. He had gone very still in the way that people go still when they see something they cannot categorize. Not fear exactly. The thing before fear. The recognition that the world has just shifted slightly sideways in a way that cannot be undone. Captain Hartfield said, "You need to see this." Calloway leaned over. The alert was not from air traffic control. It had not come through the airline's private operations channel. It had not come from any of the 17 communication systems that a commercial aircraft of this type was equipped to receive. It had come through something else entirely. A channel that Calloway had been briefed on exactly once in a classified operations seminar required of all senior captains flying domestic routes that passed through certain airspace corridors. A channel that existed for national emergency scenarios so severe that the briefing instructor had described them only in the abstract as theoretical contingencies, as things that happened in simulations and in history, and not, God willing, in the actual sky. The screen read code black, Valkyrie present, identify and engage discreetly. Calloway read it twice. Then he looked at the passenger manifest on the adjacent tablet. And there it was beside a single name in the economy section, a small symbol rendered in the digital display with a precision that suggested it had been placed there deliberately carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A triangle. Inside it, a circle. The glyph pulsed once, slow and steady like a heartbeat. The name beside it read Claire Novak. Row 9, Seat A. No additional information, no agency designation, no clearance level, no instruction beyond what was already on the screen. Calloway sat with it for a moment. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was cloudless and pale, the kind of winter blue that looks beautiful and reveals nothing. "Have you ever seen that symbol before?" he asked Hartfield. "No, sir." "Neither have I." He paused. "Keep us steady." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the cabin. Claire heard him before she saw him. She had been watching the ground shrink beneath the window, the plains of eastern Colorado flattening out into geometry, into the kind of distance that makes every problem feel temporarily smaller. The engine noise was a steady low pressure behind her ears. The man across the aisle had fallen asleep with his mouth open. A child 3 rows back was asking her mother with increasing urgency about a snack. Then she heard footsteps that belonged to someone moving through a space they owned. Not aggressive, not hurried. The measured, deliberate pace of authority that had been worn in over decades until it no longer needed to announce itself. She turned her head slightly. The captain of the aircraft was standing in the aisle beside row 9. He was looking at the overhead compartment above her seat, his expression exactly as neutral as a man practicing neutrality. His voice, when it came, was barely above a breath, barely audible over the engine noise and the ambient sounds of 186 people going about their morning. He said one word: Valkyrie. Everything stopped. It was not a dramatic stopping. There were no outward signs. Her hands did not move. Her posture did not change. Her face did not shift in any way that the passenger across the aisle, or the businessman in 8B, or anyone else in the immediate vicinity would have noticed or remembered. But inside Claire Novak, in some deep and structural place, that 6 years of quiet library work and early bedtimes, and tending to a small container garden on her apartment balcony, had not managed to reach something that had been sealed shut. Opened. She turned her head and looked at him directly. "Where did you get that name?" He did not answer with words. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small laminated card, visible only to her, held for less than 2 seconds. She did not need more than 2 seconds. The same triangle, the same circle inside it. Official, unmistakable, real. Her stomach dropped approximately 4 floors. "What's the situation?" she said. He leaned against the seat beside her, the posture of a captain doing a routine cabin walk. His voice remained low and precisely controlled. Minutes after takeoff, the avionics system flagged a minor alert, an access panel in the service corridor beneath the rear galley. It was opened briefly mid-climb. No crew member has a reason to access that panel in the air. We thought it was a sensor anomaly until we received the message. You received the message after the panel was accessed? Yes. Which means someone triggered something when they opened it. She paused one beat. Who else knows about the alert? My co-pilot. Keep it there. She breathed in slowly. Do you trust your crew? He did not hesitate in the way that people hesitate when they are calculating the right answer. He hesitated in the way that people hesitate when the answer is so obvious that saying it out loud feels redundant. With my life. Good. I need access to crew areas, the security camera feed if you have one, and a spare uniform top. I need to move through this cabin without raising anything. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just confirmed that the theoretical scenario from the classified seminar was in fact happening in the actual sky. Follow me, he said. She reached under the seat in front of her and pulled out her carry-on. On the overhead bin, she had known without knowing why she knew that she might need it quickly. Inside the bag, a roll of medical tape, a USB drive, and a multi-tool that, among its other functions, could open virtually any access panel on a Boeing aircraft. She had told herself when she packed those things that it was just habit, that it did not mean anything, that everyone carried things they no longer needed. She had almost believed that too. The service corridor behind the rear galley was narrow and slightly warm from the proximity of the galley equipment. It smelled of coffee and recycled air, and the faint specific smell of aircraft interiors that travelers who fly often know without being able to name. Dana, the lead flight attendant, looked up when Claire followed the captain through the curtain. She was a capable woman in her mid-40s with the professionally arranged expression of someone who had learned to absorb surprises without visibly absorbing them. She did not question the captain's brief explanation. She handed over a folded blue uniform shirt without asking for a reason. Claire put it on over her hoodie, tucked the collar, and became to any casual observer a crew member doing routine cabin work. The transformation took 11 seconds. The access panel in the service corridor was at floor level, a recessed latch flush with the floor standard on all aircraft of this type. The kind of thing that blended into its surroundings well enough that most passengers, even frequent flyers, would never register its existence. Claire knelt beside it. She removed one glove from her jacket pocket, pressed two fingers to the floor beside the latch, and lifted them slowly. "Someone's been here," she said quietly. Calloway crouched beside her, going, "Could be a pre-flight maintenance check." "Look at the dust," she pointed. The floor carried the fine, settled particulate that accumulates in any enclosed space cleaned on a schedule rather than constantly. The pattern of disturbance was recent, fresh, and the impression left was too small for any crew member she had passed. "This was accessed in the air after we reached cruising altitude." She stood. "Whoever did this was down here recently. Maybe 20 minutes ago, maybe less." Calloway's jaw tightened in the way that jaws tighten when a man is working hard not to say something he cannot take back. "What are we looking at?" he said. "Sabotage." "Not exactly." She looked at him steadily. "Someone who wanted to crash this plane would have done it already. The tools for that are simpler and faster. What we're looking at is something more patient, more deliberate. Someone doesn't want to destroy this aircraft. They want to redirect it." He was quiet for a moment. "Ghost flight. That's the term." Just then, Dana's voice came through the internal intercom with the particular steadiness of a woman trained to communicate alarm without sounding alarmed. "Captain, passenger in mid-cabin, row 13, exhibiting unusual behavior. Nothing critical, just odd." Calloway and Claire looked at each other. They moved. His name, as it would later turn out, was not on the manifest. But at that moment, he was simply the man in the beige jacket standing near the lavatory at row 13. Not using the lavatory, not returning to his seat, not talking to anyone, not doing any of the things that a person standing near a lavatory on a commercial aircraft might reasonably be doing. He was watching. Claire saw it from 4 rows back, through the gap between seat headrests. The angle of his attention, the way his eyes moved in a pattern too systematic to be boredom. Cockpit. Floor panel. Cockpit. The overhead bins near the front of the economy section. Cockpit again. He was tracking the access points. He was running the geometry of the cabin in his head, the way a person runs geometry when they are waiting for something to happen or verifying that something already has. Then he glanced back, and for one fraction of 1 second, his eyes found Claire. She had not been looking at him the way a flight attendant looks at a passenger. She had been looking at him the way she used to look at people in rooms where looking the wrong way at someone was the last mistake you made. He registered it. She watched him register it. Not fear, something more controlled than fear and more dangerous. Recognition. The recognition of someone trained meeting someone else who was trained. He turned back toward the lavatory and started moving toward it. His right hand was inside his jacket. "Move," Claire said. She was already in the aisle. She walked quickly and quietly the way she had walked through a lot of places where quiet and quick were the only options. She grabbed a coffee tray from an empty cart near row 11. Not as a weapon, not yet, just as something to hold something that made her look like she was doing something purposeful. When she reached the lavatory, she pressed her ear briefly to the door. Movement inside, something being shifted, the very faint sound of a panel being lifted. She waited 5 seconds. She knocked twice. "Sir Flight Attendant, just checking in." Nothing. She used the universal key on the panel beside the door. The lock disengaged. The door opened 1 inch. Inside, the man in the beige jacket was crouched near the base of the toilet, his hands working at a panel below the sink. The panel was up. In his right hand was a black rectangular device, approximately the size and thickness of a hardcover novel. It had a digital display on one face, currently showing a low, steady green light. Compact, purpose-built, the kind of hardware that did not come from any store. Claire hit the door with her shoulder. The man reacted fast, faster than the crouch had suggested he could, spinning and driving his weight into her before the door was fully open. The coffee tray caught him across the ribs on the backswing. He was strong and he was trained, and for 3 seconds in the small, airless space of the lavatory, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Then she got his wrist, turned it the wrong way for his elbow, planted her left forearm against his shoulder blade, and used the wall to finish the argument. His face met the wall. He stopped arguing. The device hit the floor with a soft, dense sound. Claire picked it up. The green light faded. She sealed it inside the crew waste container. Container latched it shut and zip-tied his wrist behind him with a restraint from her jacket pocket. She pulled him out of the lavatory by the collar. 3 or 4 nearby passengers looked up. She met their eyes with the calm, slightly apologetic expression of a flight attendant managing a medical situation. "He's not feeling well," she said evenly. "We're going to get him settled." The explanation landed without resistance. People on airplanes are powerfully motivated to accept non-alarming explanations for alarming things. In the galley, Calloway was waiting. He looked at the man, then at Claire, then at the device in her hand. She held it up. Calloway looked at it. He had enough context from the last 20 minutes to understand what he was looking at. "Decoy," she said. He frowned. "You're certain. This is crude, temporary, consumer grade compared to what something like this actually needs to be to redirect a commercial aircraft without triggering alarms." She set it on the galley counter. "Someone wanted us to find it, wanted us to think we'd identified and neutralized the threat, while the real operation continued undisturbed." She looked back through the half-open curtain at the rows of oblivious passengers. "There is someone else on this plane, something else, and we have not found it yet." Calloway put his hands on the galley counter and went quiet in the way that experienced men go quiet when they are absorbing information that changes the shape of everything they thought they understood about the last 45 minutes. "How certain are you, Sadim?" "Completely," she said. She was already moving. She stood at the galley curtain and studied the manifest on Calloway's tablet. She moved through the names and seat numbers with the focused speed of someone who had spent years reading documents that hid the important thing inside the unimportant things. Her finger stopped. Row 14, seat C, no boarding scan recorded, no ID on file, no reservation number that matched any legitimate booking in the airline's system. The seat existed. The seat had a passenger, but in the database the passenger did not. 14C, she said. "Who's sitting there?" Calloway checked the camera feed on the tablet. The seat was empty, tray table down. A magazine open on the seat face down at a page somewhere in the middle, the way magazines look when someone has stepped away intending to return. He had not returned. Dana appeared beside them quiet. "The man who was sitting there went toward the front lavatory about 10 minutes ago." Claire moved forward without explaining. She covered the distance between the galley and the first-class curtain at a pace that left no room for interruption and pushed through into first class. Every seat occupied, drinks on tray tables, tablets and newspapers, and the practiced disengagement of people who fly premium cabins enough that the novelty had worn away years ago. Except one. Row 2, the aisle seat. A woman in dark, oversized sunglasses, both arms folded across her chest, legs uncrossed, feet flat on the floor. No carry-on in the footwell. No drink, no tablet, no headphones, no book, no phone. Nothing in her hands and nothing around her that suggested she had brought herself on this journey for any of the reasons that people typically bring themselves on journeys. She was sitting the way people sit when they are maintaining a position, when they are waiting for something they have already planned for, when the waiting itself is part of the work. Claire walked to her row and looked up at the overhead bin above her seat. The latch was not fully closed, a gap of perhaps half an inch along the right side. Every other bin in the first-class cabin was sealed firmly without exception. This one had been opened recently and not fully re-engaged. "Is that your bag?" Claire asked. Helpful, professionally warm, the woman in the sunglasses tilted her head very slightly. She said nothing. Claire reached up and opened the bin. The carry-on inside was black standard dimensions, no visible tags or identifying marks. She gripped the handle to slide it out, and the weight of it hit her before it was fully clear of the bin. Too heavy, considerably too heavy for anything a person legitimately packed for a domestic flight. Something shifted inside it as it came free, a dense, solid movement, the movement of engineered weight. She lowered it to the floor, set it down, unzipped it partway. Inside, wrapped in a precision-cut foam insert, was a gray metal device the size of a thick, hardcover book. Clean edges, sealed casing without visible screws or access ports. A small digital display on the upper face active showing a slow, steady blue pulse. Not the crude green of the device from the lavatory. This was different. This was the real architecture underneath the decoy, a broadcast-grade encrypted transmitter. The type of hardware that did not redirect a single aircraft's navigation. the type that communicated outward, to satellites, to receiving stations far from the aircraft and far from Chicago, and far from anything that a flight from Denver to Illinois had any business being in range of. Claire stood up slowly. She looked at the woman. "You're not here to fly anywhere," she said. The woman in the sunglasses offered a thin smile. Not pride exactly. The expression of someone who had known from the beginning of all of this how the next part of the scene would go. "Neither are you," the woman said. Then she came up out of the seat. She was fast. She was trained in the kind of physical discipline that does not come from gyms or recreational martial arts, but from the specific institutions that teach people to operate in small spaces against people who are also trained. She came up leading with her left shoulder, reaching for Claire's wrist with her right hand. Claire had expected her to move, had been expecting it since she saw the seated posture. She had not known the timing, and she had not known the angle. And for 4 seconds in the aisle of the first-class cabin of Flight 717 with the Rocky Mountains an hour behind them, and Chicago still 40 minutes ahead, two women who had both been built by the same broken system did what the system had built them to do. The passengers in first class scattered. Someone screamed. Seat-back tray tables collapsed. Claire locked the woman's wrist on the backswing and drove her into the bulkhead with enough force to take the next movement out of her. The woman fought through it, tried to get her feet back under her, got one knee up. Claire used the galley cart that Dana had materialized from somewhere in the controlled chaos as leverage, pinned the woman's arm behind her back at the angle that ends conversations, and held. 20 seconds. The woman's wrists were restrained to the armrest. Dana was already moving passengers back. Calloway was in the doorway. The device was on the floor, its blue light still pulsing. Untouched. Claire straightened. She was breathing harder than she preferred to breathe in situations that required clear thinking. She looked at the device. "Biometric lock," she said. "Thumbprint or retinal? Possibly both." She looked at Calloway. "If we tamper without the correct input, it may wipe, or it may do something considerably less convenient than wipe." She pulled out a strip of reflective mylar from her jacket pocket and angled it to redirect the display screen's output toward the camera on Calloway's phone without making physical contact with the device. The display gave her what she needed to read: a countdown sequence, embedded in the software layer beneath the broadcast function. 12 minutes. Calloway read over her shoulder. "What happens at 0, full external integration? After that, the aircraft's navigation system isn't ours anymore. Someone on the ground or in orbit takes the wheel and we become passengers." She looked at him. He was pale in the way that men go pale when the worst-case scenario stops being a scenario. "Captain, what is our current altitude?" 37,000 feet. "And our heading?" He went to the nearest display and checked it and went very still. "We should be over Central Illinois," he said. "We're not over Central Illinois." The aircraft had been drifting, slowly, incrementally, by degrees so small that no single moment had triggered an alarm. The navigation array had been fed adjusted data since shortly after takeoff through the crude relay from the lavatory, and then when that was disrupted, through the more sophisticated continuous feed from the device still pulsing on the first-class floor. The accumulated drift over 40 minutes had placed them considerably north of their filed route, in airspace that had not been designated for them, in airspace that had not been notified to expect them. Chicago Tower still thought they were on course. Chicago Tower was looking at data that was not real. "Get me the med kit," Claire said to Dana. "Alcohol pads, duct tape." She looked at Calloway once more. "And I'm going to need approximately 30 seconds of the woman's cooperation, whether or not she's willing to provide it." He looked at the woman with the sunglasses restrained to the armrest, watching Claire with the same thin, patient expression she had worn since the beginning. "She's not going to cooperate," he said. "I know," Claire said. "I'm not asking her to." She tore a strip of duct tape and pressed it firmly against the pad of the woman's right thumb. Held it for several seconds. The woman did not resist. She did not need to. She was already doing the only thing she had left to do, which was to wait and to know something that Claire did not know yet, and to smile at the appropriate moment. Claire peeled the tape slowly. The ridge pattern of the fingerprint was visible in the residue, faint but intact. She pressed the tape to her own thumb, aligned the ridges with the scanner's surface geometry, reduced the friction between them with an alcohol pad, and held it against the scanner. The device blinked. Denied. She adjusted the pressure, the angle, the contact point, blinked again. Access granted. Administrator mode. She exhaled. She worked the interface, overriding the broadcast command, sending false feedback to the receiving node. scrambling the command relay so that whatever station or satellite was waiting on the other end of this signal received noise instead of coordinates. The device pushed back its internal logic, actively resistant, coded by someone who had anticipated interference and built the system to fight it. The countdown continued. 8 minutes. 7. Then the device vibrated once sharply and the blue pulse stopped. The cabin seemed to exhale. Calloway's voice came in from the cockpit where he had retreated to check instruments. Navigation systems returning to normal. Chicago Tower has us on radar. Course corrected. A pause. They never knew we left. Claire stood up from the floor, both devices neutralized, both operatives restrained. The blue pulse was gone. It should have felt finished. She looked at the woman. The woman was still wearing the thin smile, still patient, still waiting for this moment she had known was coming since she boarded this flight. "You stopped it," the woman said. "You stopped the broadcast." Yes, the expression on the woman's face did not change, but not the delivery. The cabin noise filled the space between them. Engine hum, the ambient sounds of 186 people who had no idea what had just happened 4 rows ahead of them. Claire said quietly, "What delivery?" The woman said nothing else. Claire turned and walked back through the first-class curtain with her mind already moving 3 moves ahead, already arriving at the understanding that settled in her chest like cold water. The transmitters were never the point. The fight with the woman was never the point. All of it, every piece of it, was noise. Elaborate and convincing, and specifically designed to occupy a trained person for exactly as long as it took. Someone had brought something onto this aircraft, not a signal. Something physical. Something that needed only to travel far enough before it was found. She moved back into economy past the rows of oblivious passengers and stopped at row 14. The man in the beige jacket sat exactly where she had left him, sedated and restrained. But beneath his seat, half visible, deliberately not shoved far enough under to disappear, a duffel bag. Zipper slightly torn. Sitting in the exposed space between the seat rail and the floor, as if placed there to be found by the right person at the right moment. She knelt. She unzipped it slowly. Inside, wrapped in carbon-lined black cloth and secured at all 4 corners with reinforced aluminum brackets, was a titanium briefcase. No tags, no serial markings, no airline scan stickers. The weight of it, when she lifted it free, told her everything she needed to know before she opened the latches. This was not luggage. This was cargo. She found Declan Marsh in seat 108 11 minutes later. He was young, early 20s, wearing a hoodie and earbuds backpack across his lap. He looked up as she approached, calm, even smiling, with the look of someone who had been expecting this moment and was not surprised to have arrived in it. She walked him to the galley. She told him what she knew. She watched his smile change shape but not disappear. He was a courier. He was the carrier. Everything else on this aircraft had been designed to create the conditions in which the carrier could move undetected. He had completed his task the moment the case traveled far enough off course. The aircraft touched down at O'Hare. Federal agents were on the jet bridge before the door was fully open. Claire stood in the aisle with the titanium briefcase on the seat beside her and raised one hand. "Don't touch the case," she said. She controlled the chain of custody. She watched them take the 3 suspects off the plane one by one. Declan Marsh, the last one through the door, turned his head at the jet bridge and gave her a faint smile. The smile of someone who had done what he was sent to do. She picked up the titanium briefcase and walked off the plane into whatever came next. She had not opened the book past page 47 in 6 years. She had a feeling she was not going to get the chance to open it today either. The secure lounge in Terminal 3 was the kind of room that did not appear on any airport map. It was accessed through a door marked maintenance that sat between a Hudson News and a charging station kiosk, unremarkable in the way that important things are often made unremarkable on purpose. The room itself was small and deliberately plain. A metal table, 4 chairs. Overhead lighting tuned to the frequency that made everyone sitting beneath it look slightly worse than they actually felt. A wall-mounted camera in the upper left corner that was not concealed because concealment was unnecessary. Everyone who ever sat in this room already knew they were being recorded. Claire sat on one side of the table. The man across from her had no visible badge, no nameplate on his jacket, no identifying information of any kind that she could locate in the 40 seconds she had spent cataloging him before he sat down. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the compressed economic posture of someone who had spent a career in rooms like this one and had made his peace with the power that invisible rooms conferred. His eyes were the color of old steel and moved with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who believed that most people revealed themselves if you simply waited long enough. He had dropped a folder on the table when he sat down. The tab read Echo Directive. Below that, stamped in black ink whose edges had begun to blur with age, deactivated. He looked at her for a long moment. Funny thing, he said finally. His voice was deliberate. The voice of a man who had learned that controlled pace was its own form of pressure. We were told that project was shelved. Quietly. Completely. That all associated personnel had been processed out and that the program no longer existed in any operational sense. He rested one hand on the folder without opening it. And then someone uses a code name from that dead program to divert a domestic flight, plants a relay transmitter in an aircraft lavatory, and smuggles what appears to be Tier 3 encrypted intelligence hardware through a major American airport. And you, he paused, just happened to be in seat 9A. You know how many flights leave Denver on a Tuesday morning, Claire said. I do. He did not smile. I also know that the pilot of your aircraft recognized your operational code name from a classified emergency brief that was not part of his standard certification, which raises a question about where he received that information and why, of all the flights leaving Denver, the one carrying a defunct code name happened to also be carrying you. Maybe you should be asking him. I will be. After you explain to me why someone would go to this much trouble to reactivate an identity that your own signature helped bury 6 years ago. Claire kept her expression exactly where she had placed it when she sat down. Neutral, present, slightly cooperative without being forthcoming. If I knew why, she said, I would already be looking for them instead of sitting here. He studied her. Then he reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. A printed still from an airport surveillance camera. The timestamp in the lower corner read that morning, 2 hours and 17 minutes before Flight 717 departed. The location was the International Departures Hall, Terminal 2. The image showed a man in a dark suit standing near the far edge of the departures board. He was not looking at the board. He was not moving toward any gate. He was standing still with the patient stillness of someone who had come to that specific location for a reason that had nothing to do with catching a flight. He was watching the domestic departures display. Claire looked at the photograph. The world did a thing that worlds sometimes do when information arrives that should be impossible. It got very quiet. Not the quiet of silence, but the quiet of recalibration. The quiet of a mind rapidly dismantling one version of reality and constructing a different one in its place. She knew that face. She had known that face for 15 years. She had sat across a desk from it in 3 different countries. She had received orders from it and filed reports to it and trusted it with information that in the wrong hands would have ended careers and possibly lives. She had stood beside it at the memorial service for an operative who had not come home from Budapest, and she had watched it remain composed in the way that faces remain composed when composure is a professional requirement rather than a natural condition. She had also stood in a parking garage in Northern Virginia in the autumn of 2019 and been told by that face that the decision she had made on her last mission was understandable, that the outcome was not her fault, that the agency valued everything she had contributed, and that her transition out of active service had been arranged with care and would be handled with discretion. She had believed him. She had believed him because she needed to believe something, and he was the only person offering her anything to believe in. Director Alan Strauss, mid-60s now if the photograph was recent. He had been a lean, precise man when she first knew him, the kind of man whose physical economy suggested that nothing he did was accidental. Age had not taken that from him. If anything, it had concentrated it. He had been declared killed in action in the spring of 2022. A car bomb in a Chicago parking structure on a morning when he had been in the city for a consultation that was not in any official schedule. The explosion had been thorough. The investigation had been brief. The conclusion had been definitive. Alan Strauss was dead. Alan Strauss was standing in Terminal 2 of O'Hare International Airport 2 hours and 17 minutes before Claire's flight departed, watching the departures board with the stillness of a man who had come to see something off. The man across the table was watching her read the photograph. She gave him nothing he could use. She had spent too many years in too many rooms. Your case, he said, has just been reclassified. Ms. Novak, you are now a subject of an active federal threat assessment. Claire placed the photograph back on the table. She aligned it carefully with the edge of the folder. She looked at him. I'd like to make a phone call, she said, to someone outside this building. Someone who has been outside every building for long enough to see what's inside them clearly. He was quiet for a moment. You have 10 minutes, he said. He stood up. I'll be outside the door. He left. Claire sat in the empty room for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up the titanium briefcase that she had insisted accompany her into the room, and that the agents, after considerable argument, had allowed, and walked to the room's single window. The window was narrow and sat high on the wall and looked out on a service road running along the exterior of the terminal. She was not looking at the service road. She was looking at the reflection in the glass, at the camera in the upper left corner of the room behind her, at its angle and its range. She was calculating. The south side of Chicago in November is not a place that invites lingering. The wind comes off the lake and finds the gaps between buildings with the focused persistence of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has not lost interest. Claire had been walking for 11 minutes since leaving the terminal. She had taken a rideshare 2 stops east of where she needed to go, paid cash for the last portion at a corner store where she also bought 2 bottles of water and a pair of cheap wool gloves, and approached the building from the alley on its west side. 3 stories of weathered brick, 2 units per floor, the kind of building that looked like it had been the same for 40 years and intended to remain so. The door to the ground floor unit was metal. She knocked 3 times short, paused then once. Silence. Then the sound of a deadbolt. Then a chain. Then the door opened 4 inches, and an eye looked through the gap, and the door closed again, and the chain came off, and the door opened fully. The woman who stepped back to let her in was in her late 30s. She wore a dark jacket and had the kind of build that came from years of physical work that was not recreational. Her hair was dark and shorter than Claire remembered it. Her eyes were quick and precise and carried the quality of attention that comes from sustained experience in environments where paying attention is the difference between different kinds of outcomes. She was soaking wet from the rain that had started sometime in the last hour. She did not look surprised to see Claire. She looked like someone who had been expecting her and was relieved the wait was over. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Nora Kessler said. Claire stepped inside. The door closed behind her. "Didn't think I'd still be here to see." Nora Kessler had been a technical operative with Echo Directive for 8 years before the program was decommissioned. She had been in those 8 years the best systems analyst the program had. She could read encrypted architecture the way other people read text, finding the structure underneath the surface, the logic beneath the code. She had also been, in Claire's experience, one of approximately 3 people in the entirety of the program whose judgment she trusted without qualification. She had officially vanished from any traceable existence in early 2024. A forwarding address in Tijuana that resolved to a vacant lot, a phone number that disconnected 3 days after it was first listed, a bank account that went dormant and then closed. She was standing in a safe house on the south side of Chicago, looking like someone who had never left. "They sent the message through the case, didn't they?" Nora said. It was not a question. She was already moving to the table at the center of the room where a laptop sat open and 2 additional monitors were arranged in a loose arc. The equipment was civilian grade on the surface and considerably more than that underneath. "Strauss," Claire said. Nora turned around. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise. The acknowledgement of a thing that had been suspected and was now confirmed. "Sit down," she said. "There's more than you have." Claire sat. Nora pulled a chair around to the same side of the table. She navigated to a file that was already open and turned the monitor slightly so Claire could read it without leaning. "Strauss didn't go rogue," Nora said. "That's the first thing. That's the thing that changes all the other things." She let that land for a moment. He was authorized, continuously, through the decommissioning of Echo, through his own staged death, through everything that has happened in the 3 years since the car bomb that wasn't a car bomb. He has been operating under a black budget authorization signed by a sitting member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind finding the window frames. "Which member?" Claire said. "The chair," Nora said. Claire looked at the screen. She looked at the name. She had heard it in briefings. She had seen it attached to oversight documents that she had prepared and submitted through official channels, and that had been received apparently by the very person whose authorization was funding the operation she was now trying to understand. "Glass Citadel," she said. "You've seen it. The case before the feds took the hardware." She had photographed the document header on the drive before surrendering it, an old habit. "What is it?" Nora turned to the second monitor. She pulled up a map of the continental United States. 5 markers pulsing red distributed across the country with a specific geography that Claire recognized the shape of before she understood the individual points. "Emergency alert system," Nora said. 5 primary nodes. The infrastructure that broadcasts emergency notifications to every television set Every radio, every wireless device in the country, the system that tells 330 million people when there is a threat and what to do about it. She looked at Claire. Strauss has spent 3 years building access architecture into each of those nodes. Ghost protocol, invisible to the standard audits. Waiting. Waiting for what? For him to be ready, for Glass Citadel to activate. Nora pulled up a second file. The broadcast isn't a message. It's not a threat or a warning or a manifesto. It's documentation. Fabricated documentation constructed with the kind of craft that requires access to genuine classified formatting, genuine operational language, genuine interagency protocol structures. Files that show 11 current federal officials as foreign intelligence assets. Cabinet level, intelligence community leadership. People whose removal from their positions in the middle of a national emergency broadcast would create exactly the kind of institutional vacuum that a prepared organization could move into. Claire sat with that for a moment. The wind found the window again. He's not trying to destroy the government, she said. No, he's trying to replace it. Nora said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Claire stood up and walked to the window and looked at the street below. A woman pushed a stroller through the rain with the focused economy of someone who had things to accomplish, and the weather was not going to change that. A dog pulled at a leash attached to an elderly man who did not appear to be losing the argument. 3 years, the car bomb in 2022 that had been thorough enough to close the investigation quickly. The Senate authorization hiding behind the oversight structure that was supposed to prevent exactly what it was enabling. The transmitters on the plane that morning, none of it had been the point. It had been noise. An elaborate mechanism designed to occupy the right person for just long enough, to move the case, to bring her back. She turned around. He knows where you are, she said. Yes, he's known since I made contact with Cypher 3 months ago. I've been operating on the assumption that my location is not a secret and adjusting accordingly. Cypher, still in Brooklyn. Same basement, different equipment. He found the Citadel architecture 6 weeks ago, buried inside a routine update to one of the node management systems. He's been mapping it since then. He knows the activation sequence. He knows the timeline. How long? The countdown we stopped on the plane bought us time, but the system has redundancies. Strauss built them in. He anticipated interdiction at the delivery stage. The hardware on that aircraft was not the only path to activation. She paused. We have enough time to reach him before he has everything he needs, not much more than that. Where is he? Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains. There's a facility that was part of Echo's original infrastructure built into a ridge below a decommissioned Forest Service station. It was removed from every federal property record after Echo was officially dissolved. It doesn't exist on paper. It's been active for 3 years. Claire absorbed this. She walked back to the table and sat down again. She looked at the pulsing red markers on the map. She thought about the titanium case, which was now in federal custody, and which contained, among other things, a file with her name on it that described her as a traitor of the highest order. She thought about the photograph of Alan Strauss standing at the departures board watching. She thought about what it meant that he had done that, not as intimidation, not as misdirection, as a specific communication directed at one specific person who would recognize its meaning. He wanted her found. He wanted her pulled back into play. He wanted her to be the one who came after him because she was the only one who knew enough of the right things to actually reach him, and because reaching him was not a trap. It was an invitation. She looked at Nora. You said he knows why I left. Nora was quiet for a moment. She turned the laptop slightly away and looked at the table between them. He told me, before everything shifted, before I understood what he was building. She looked up. He kept the file, everything from your last mission. The full debrief, the decision you made, and the outcome, and what came after. Claire said nothing. He also wrote a letter to the family of the operative who died. He didn't send it through any official channel. He sent it personally through his own address under his own name. He took partial responsibility for the operational parameters that put that agent in the position your decision was responding to. She paused. I read it. It was the kind of letter that takes something out of you to write. The room was very quiet. He did that, Claire said, and then spent 3 years building a system to replace the government. Yes, those two things are not contradictory to him. No, Nora said. I don't think they are. I think he wrote that letter because he genuinely believed the institution that sent that agent into that position was broken beyond repair. And I think Glass Citadel is in his mind the logical extension of that belief. She looked at Claire carefully. The diagnosis is not entirely wrong. The treatment would kill the patient. Then Nora navigated to a secondary file on the left monitor. She pulled it up and looked at it for a moment before speaking. There's one more thing, she said. In the operational records Strauss shared with me before I understood what I was being read into, there was a medical subsection. Implant protocols. Behavioral modification architecture for high-value assets that the program wanted to be able to recall and, if necessary, neutralize remotely. She looked at Claire carefully. I ran your name against the implant log. Claire looked at her. Your 2019 exit medical, Nora said. The comprehensive evaluation before they processed you out. It wasn't only an evaluation. She pulled up a frequency file on the secondary monitor. There is a device placed during that evaluation. It operates on a targeted signal frequency and produces temporary disruption of the voluntary motor system. Not permanent, not lethal, long enough to change the outcome of a confrontation. She closed the file. I've had the counter signal prepared for 6 weeks. It buys approximately 90 seconds of motor function against the disruption. I was going to tell you when it became relevant. She paused. It's relevant now. Claire absorbed this without expression. Someone had placed a switch inside her body in October of 2019, on the same Tuesday she had driven west out of Washington and told herself the silence ahead was strength. She had believed she was walking out of a room. She had been carrying a door the whole time. I'll take the counter signal, she said. Nora fitted the receiver into Claire's left ear. Small, flesh-toned, it would not register in any standard security sweep. The door at the back of the room opened. Brett Calloway came in carrying his flight jacket and a slight excess of rain on his shoulders. He had managed to navigate the primary federal detainment by virtue of being a pilot whose aircraft needed to be formally processed and who had cooperated with the initial investigation in a way that was thorough enough to be credible and incomplete enough to create space. He set his jacket on the chair nearest the door and looked at the 2 women in the monitors and the map with the red pulsing markers. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table. A paperback novel, soft cover slightly worn at the corner. The page marked with a fold exactly where she had left it. Page 47. He had picked it up from the seat. She had left it behind when she followed him down the aisle, and he had carried it off the plane without mentioning it, and he had brought it here. He did not say anything about it. He just put it on the table where she could see it and took his jacket back up and moved to look at the monitors. Claire looked at the book for a long moment. Then she looked up at Nora. Tell me everything Cypher found about the activation sequence, she said. All of it, from the beginning. The basement in Brooklyn had the atmosphere of a place made habitable through sustained effort rather than design. Extension cords ran along the baseboards with the tidiness of someone who had made their peace with living among cables. Monitors were stacked and angled on shelves reinforced to hold them. The air carried the faint warmth of active electronics in the combination of coffee and dust that accumulates in spaces where someone spends most of their waking hours seated in front of screens. The person seated in front of the screens looked up when Claire came down the stairs. He was young, mid-20s at most, wearing a hoodie that had faded from navy blue to an indeterminate color. He had the eyes of someone who had been looking at encrypted data for so long that ordinary visual information registered as something to be parsed rather than simply seen. He had been calling himself Cypher since long before Claire had heard the name through Nora's contact chain. You brought Valkyrie, he said, looking at Claire with the direct assessment of someone who had heard a great deal about a person and was performing a rapid calibration against the information. Either things are moving faster than I thought or they've already moved. Both, Claire said. She came down into the basement and looked at the screens. Show me what you found. He walked her through it without preamble. The Glass Citadel activation system was built into the management layer of the emergency alert system's 5 primary node servers. Not a virus in any conventional sense. Structural. Written into the system in fragments distributed across routine update packages over 18 months, assembling itself incrementally, testing its own components against the live system without triggering any monitoring protocols, because each individual fragment was too small and too standard-looking to register as anomalous. The activation required a single command input from an external source. One signal. The signal would consolidate the assembled fragments into a functioning broadcast engine and push the fabricated documentation simultaneously through all 5 nodes appearing to originate from the emergency management protocols themselves. It would carry the authentication signatures of 3 separate federal agencies. It would look to every system designed to evaluate it completely legitimate. Can you stop it from here? Claire said. Cypher looked at the screens for long enough that the answer was already clear before he said it. Not entirely. I can disrupt the consolidation. I can introduce enough noise into the command pathway that the signal degrades before it reaches all 5 nodes. Maybe 3 of them, maybe 2. He turned around. To shut it down completely, you need to reach the origination point, the source where the activation command is issued, and you need to do it before the command goes out. Oh, Blue Ridge Mountains, Claire said. He's been routing everything through a relay station at that location for the last 8 months. All the traffic, all the test signals, everything originates there and returns there. He paused. It's not on any map I can access officially. I found it through the signal patterns themselves triangulating the origin point across multiple transmissions. How long, she said. He pulled up the timeline he had been tracking. Based on the disruption of the hardware delivery this morning, he loses the primary activation window. He knew that was possible. He built in a secondary window. He looked at the clock on the screen. 6 hours, approximately. Claire looked at Calloway. She looked at Nora. She thought about Alan Strauss, about the letter he had written to a family that had lost someone, about the system he had built in the years since, about the fact that he had gone to the trouble of planting her name in the case of staging the entire morning as an elaborate mechanism for bringing her to this moment in this basement, looking at these screens. He had known she would get here. He had built it so she would get here. He wanted her to come. She picked up the book from where she had set it on the corner of Cypher's equipment shelf. She looked at the cover. She looked at the fold at page 47. She put it in her jacket pocket. I need a vehicle, she said, and I need someone who can be in 2 places at once. She looked at Cypher. If I can reach the origination point and disable the activation system physically, can you lock the signal pathway from this end simultaneously, prevent any secondary command from using the network, even if the primary source is eliminated? He thought about it with the actual rapid calculation of someone running real numbers against real system constraints. Yes, he said, but you'd need to give me a signal from inside the facility, proof of access, something the system would recognize as coming from the authorized location so I can use it to authenticate a counter command. What kind of signal? The facility's own internal network. If you can get inside it even briefly and push a handshake to my relay, I can use that authentication to lock the broadcast architecture from the outside. How much time do you need once you have the handshake? 90 seconds, maybe less. 90 seconds inside a facility that did not exist, run by a man who had spent 3 years anticipating exactly this. Claire zipped her jacket. Get the vehicle, she said to Calloway. She looked at Nora. How much of the facility layout did Strauss share with you before you understood what he was building? Nora reached for her jacket. Enough, she said. They went up the stairs and out into the Brooklyn night, and the cold came at them from the street the way cold always comes in November, without apology, without announcement, as though it had simply always been there, and they were the ones who had arrived late. Claire reached into her jacket pocket and pressed her thumb against the cover of the book, feeling the weight of a thing that had been waiting 6 years for her to finish it. Then she let go and started walking. The Blue Ridge Mountains in November looked like something from before America was America. The ridgelines go dark early, the hardwood trees stripped bare by October, their branches reaching against a sky that turns the color of a bruise before 5 in the afternoon. The roads that move through this country were not designed for speed. They were designed for terrain, following the logic of the land rather than the logic of efficiency, curving where the ridge curves, dropping where the hollow drops, offering the driver no long sightlines and very little warning about what comes next. Calloway drove. He drove the way he flew, with the focused economy of someone who had learned long ago that competence looks nothing like drama. He did not speak much, neither did Claire. Nora sat in the back with a tablet on her knees and a soft-sided bag at her feet that contained tools not available through any civilian channel. The road unrolled in the headlights. The mountains absorbed them. They had left Brooklyn at 11:47 in the evening. They had 4 hours and some minutes before the secondary activation window. The drive to the coordinates that Cypher had triangulated from 6 weeks of signal mapping was 3 hours and 20 minutes under normal conditions. The conditions were not normal in several respects, but the road was one thing that cooperated, and they made it in 3 hours and 14. Calloway pulled the vehicle off the road at a logging track that had not seen active use in at least a decade, the gravel surface reclaimed at its edges by dead grass and the encroachment of the tree line. He killed the headlights. They sat in the dark for a moment. "Quarter-mile north," Nora said. "The ridge drops about 60 feet on the eastern face. The facility is built into the base of that drop. Reinforced concrete construction, 2 levels below, grade 1 level at grade, disguised as the Forest Service station. She looked up from the tablet. The station itself is a shell. The functional entry is through the lower level. There are 2 external access points. The primary is on the north face behind the station building. The secondary is a maintenance hatch on the eastern slope, approximately 40 meters from the base of the drop. How many people inside? Claire said. Based on the operational profile Strauss described to me before I understood what I was being read, into 12 security personnel rotating across 2 shifts, 6 active at any given time, plus technical staff. 3, maybe 4. She paused. And Strauss. Cameras. External perimeter, yes. Internal selective. The control room will have full coverage. The access corridors less. Claire was already making the calculations. She had been making them since Brooklyn, running them in the background the way she had always run calculations continuously and without effort the way other people breathed. She looked at Calloway. You stay with the vehicle. If we're not back in 90 minutes, you drive to the nearest cell signal and call the number Cypher gave you. I'm not staying with the vehicle. Breck. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had already made the decision and was waiting for the conversation to catch up to it. I've been flying people from one place to another for 22 years. I know what I'm equipped for and what I'm not. But I'm also not driving 3 hours into the Virginia mountains to sit in a parking spot. He held her gaze. I can cover a door. I can hold a position. Tell me what you need and I'll do it. She looked at him for a moment. The maintenance hatch on the eastern slope, she said. You hold that exit point. Nothing comes through it that isn't us. He nodded. That was all. They got out of the vehicle. They got out of... The cold came off the mountain with the authority of elevation, the kind of cold that does not negotiate. The trees were dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. No wind at this elevation, which meant sound, would carry, which meant they moved without speaking and placed their feet with attention. Nora went first on the eastern approach. She knew the topography from the operational briefings she had received, the ones she had absorbed while still believing she was being brought into something with a legitimate purpose, and she moved through it with the confidence of someone navigating from memory rather than from sight. Claire followed 2 steps back and to her left. Calloway diverged at the point where the ridge began its eastern drop, moving to the maintenance hatch position without needing to be directed. The external camera on the north face swept a pattern Nora had described in the vehicle. 17-second rotation. 11 seconds of coverage on the primary approach, 6 seconds of gap at the rightmost extent of the sweep. They moved through the gap without hesitation and without looking at the camera. The primary access door was reinforced steel set into the concrete wall of the lower level, invisible from above the ridge, and invisible from the road, and invisible from the air unless you knew precisely where to look. It had an electronic lock panel beside it, recessed and unmarked. Nora opened her bag. She worked with the concentration of someone for whom this type of problem was not novel. Her tools interfaced with the lock's architecture at the firmware level below the layer where standard security monitoring would register the intrusion as an intrusion rather than a routine system query. It took 4 minutes. Claire counted them. The door opened inward without a sound. The corridor beyond was concrete and fluorescent, running straight for 20 meters before turning right. Warm air came through the opening, the warmth of enclosed electronics and sustained human habitation. The smell of processed air and machine heat and the institutional quality of a space built for function and nothing else. They went in. The control room was at the end of the second corridor, past 2 doors that Nora bypassed with the same quiet efficiency she had used on the primary entrance. The internal cameras in the access corridors were mounted at ceiling height, their coverage angles leaving ground-level shadows along the right wall that Claire moved through with her back to the concrete and her eyes on the space ahead. She heard the security rotation before she reached the corner. 2 personnel moving on a pattern. She waited. The pattern resolved into a timing she could use, and she used it 30 seconds between positions, enough space for what needed to happen without the kind of noise that would accelerate everything. By the time she reached the door of the control room, she had accounted for 4 of the 6 active security personnel. The remaining 2 were inside, positioned at the monitoring stations that covered the 5-node displays. She could see them through the narrow, reinforced glass panel beside the door. She could also see the displays themselves. 5 screens, each showing the live status of an emergency alert system node. The countdown on the central display read 2 hours and 41 minutes. Beside it, a secondary display showed the Glass Citadel activation architecture in a state of readiness that confirmed what Cypher had described from Brooklyn. Everything assembled, everything waiting. One command input from one authorized source. And at the far end of the room, standing with his back to the door and his hands clasped behind him, looking at the 5 note displays with the patience of a man who had earned the right to be patient, was Alan Strauss. He was older than the surveillance photograph from the airport. 3 years of operational concealment and the weight of building something large and consequential had done what time does to faces when the person inside them is spending everything they have on a single purpose. His hair had gone fully white. His posture was the same. The composure was the same, the composure of a man who had decided things thoroughly before entering any room, so that he never needed to decide them inside it. She felt something complicated move through her. She did not let it settle. She opened the door. The 2 security personnel at the monitoring stations reacted with the speed of people who had been trained to react and had remained sharp enough to do it properly. Claire was faster not by much, and not through any advantage of preparation over theirs, but through the commitment of someone with nothing left to protect except the thing directly in front of her. Nora came through the door on her left. The room resolved in 11 seconds into a configuration that Claire controlled. Strauss did not move during those 11 seconds. He turned slowly at the sound of the door. He watched the 11 seconds unfold. And when they were over, he looked at Claire across the room with an expression that was not surprise and was not defeat. It was the expression of a man who had expected this and was glad the waiting was done. "Claire," he said, his voice was the same. She had not realized until she heard it again how much of her memory of the last 6 years was scored against that voice. The voice of the person who had told her the decision was understandable. The voice of the person who had told her she could go. I wondered how long it would take. She crossed the room until she was close enough that there was no pretending the situation was anything other than what it was. "You sent the case," she said. "I needed to reach you. Official channels were unavailable for obvious reasons." He looked at her with something that might in a different context have been called warmth. "And I knew you would do what you did. You have always been the most capable person in any room you walked into. I relied on that. You put my name in the files. You had me framed. I had you flagged," he said. "There's a distinction. The flag creates a chain of custody that insulates you from the federal investigation once Citadel completes and the institutional architecture shifts. You would have been questioned and cleared and emerged on the correct side of the transition." "The transition," she said. "That's what you're calling it." He turned slightly toward the 5 note displays. The countdown continued its steady reduction in the upper corner of the central screen. "You know how broken it is," he said. He said it the way a person states a shared fact, something both parties have agreed on without needing to discuss. "You spent 15 years inside it. You saw what it authorized, what it protected, what it allowed to continue because the alternative required someone to be accountable and accountability was inconvenient. You saw what it did to people who served it honestly." He paused. "You saw what it did to you." She did not answer. "I am not building something perfect," he said. "I have never believed in perfect. I am building something that does not have the structural capacity to do what this system has been doing for 30 years. The files are fabricated, yes, but every person named in them has done something real, has protected something that should have been exposed, has used the architecture of legitimacy to do things that were not legitimate. I chose them with care." 11 people, Claire said. 11 people whose removal creates the space for something better. And the 330 million people who receive that broadcast, who spend the next 6 months in the institutional chaos that follows, who lose confidence in every structure they depend on all at once without warning. "They have been living in that chaos already," Strauss said quietly. "They simply have not been shown it clearly." "That is not your call to make," Claire said. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression she recognized and had not expected to recognize. A genuine weight. The weight of a man who had thought about this argument for a long time and knew its force and had decided to carry it anyway. "Someone has to," he said. "No," she said. "Someone has to work inside it. Someone has to stay and be accountable and fight the specific failure in front of them without burning everything around it. That is harder. It is considerably less satisfying. It is the only thing that actually works." She held his gaze. "You did not go rogue because the system was broken. You went rogue because you stopped believing that working inside it was worth anything. That is a personal decision. You do not get to make it for the country." The room was quiet. The countdown continued. 2 hours and 31 minutes. Then Strauss said with the particular gentleness of a man doing something he had planned for a long time, "I know what you carry from that last mission, Claire. I know what it costs you. I wanted you to know that I acknowledged my part in it. I hope the letter reached them. She felt something tighten in her chest that she did not allow to reach her face. It did, she said. It was the right thing to do. Yes, he said, it was. He reached for the control console. The signal hit her behind the left ear. It was not pain exactly. It was the thing before pain, the neurological event that precedes sensation in the fraction of a second before the brain categorizes what is happening to the body. Her left knee went first. Then the floor came up to meet her with a speed that she had no ability to interrupt. Her hands went flat against the concrete and she registered the temperature of it, cold and absolute and indifferent, and then her arms were not holding her anymore. The device had been placed in 2019. She had been told it was a standard post-mission medical evaluation, the kind of procedure that all operatives returning from extended deployment underwent as a matter of protocol. She had sat in a medical facility in Northern Virginia and been cleared for final exit processing and signed the document and walked out into a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had not known that the evaluation had included anything beyond what she was told it included. She knew now. Strauss had built her as the key to finding him, and as the lock that stopped her once she arrived. She was the most capable person in any room she walked into. She was also the person he had spent 6 years making sure could be switched off when the moment required it. She heard him moving toward the control console. Then a tone came through the receiver in her left ear. Low and precisely calibrated. Coming through the small wireless device that Nora had fitted there in the vehicle outside Brooklyn, so small in flesh tone that it had not registered in any security sweep. Nora's voice came through it, flat and informational, delivered at the speed of someone who has calculated exactly how much time exists for what needs to be communicated. Counter frequency, 90 seconds. The tone shifted. A narrow, precisely targeted signal pushed through the receiver directly against the implant's operating frequency. Interference. Not elimination, but sufficient degradation of the device's output that the motor disruption began to degrade with it. Claire felt her right hand first, then the left. Then the weight in her shoulders redistributed as her core came back online, in the specific sequence that bodies come back online when an obstruction is removed incrementally rather than all at once. She got her left knee under her. Strauss was at the console. His hand was moving toward the activation interface, the single input field that would consolidate 6 weeks of assembled architecture and push the fabricated documentation through 5 simultaneous broadcast channels to every screen and speaker in the country. She got her right foot under her. 90 seconds. She counted them in her body in the rhythm of her own heartbeat, which had the advantage of not requiring attention. She covered the distance between herself and the console in a movement that was not graceful and was not hesitant and had no qualities beyond its functional ones. Her left hand caught the edge of the console. Her right arm came across his, deflecting the angle of his reach in a way that moved his hand from the activation interface to a space 6 inches to its left. He turned. He was stronger than she had allowed for, or she was not fully back from the disruption, or both. He put his weight into it, and they moved together across the front of the console in a contest that was not evenly matched in the way that contests between a 38-year-old woman and a 65-year-old man who had spent 30 years in intelligence operations are not evenly matched, which is to say, the outcome was not as predetermined as it might appear from the outside. Her elbow found the space below his ribs. His hand found her shoulder and used it in a way that was technically sound and would leave a bruise she would feel for a week. She moved through it. She got her feet squared. She looked at him from a distance of approximately 2 feet. He reached for the console again. She stopped him. The decision that followed was not made the way decisions in stories are sometimes made, with a moment of reflection and a visual pause that communicates its weight to an audience. It had already been made in Brooklyn, on the road in the corridor outside this room, in the 6 years before all of that, and what happened in the next 2 seconds was only the arriving of what had already been decided. The room went quiet. Strauss sat down, not onto a chair, down. The console caught his shoulder on the way. He looked at her from the floor with the expression of a man examining a conclusion he had spent years approaching and had now arrived at completely. "You were always going to be the one," he said. His voice was different now. What was left was something older and more tired and more honest. She was already at the console. She found the data ring on his right hand. It looked like a plain silver band and contained the encrypted core of the Glass Citadel operating architecture. She had seen its function described in the files Nora had shown her in Chicago. She removed it. She plugged the relay adapter that Nora had prepared in Brooklyn into the console's external port and pushed the handshake signal that Cypher was waiting for. In Brooklyn, in the basement that smelled of coffee and electronics and sustained effort, a young man in a faded hoodie watched a signal arrive on his monitoring display and began the 90-second counter-command sequence he had been prepared to execute. The alarm started 30 seconds into it. The walls of the facility shifted from fluorescent white to the red of emergency illumination. The sound that accompanied the lights was not a siren exactly, but a tone sustained and insistent, the kind of sound designed to penetrate through walls and through sleep and through every other competing input. Nora's voice came through the receiver. 60 seconds. Hold the console. Claire held the console. The door to the corridor opened. Two security personnel came through it, assessed the room with the speed of people who had trained for this category of situation, identified the relevant elements, and moved toward the relevant elements. Calloway came through the maintenance hatch at the same moment from the corridor's opposite end, and the geometry of that arrival produced a complexity of competing attention that slowed the two personnel by the 4 seconds, that 4 seconds of slowing costs. It was enough. Counter command complete. Cypher's voice came through the relay patched into Nora's channel. All 5 nodes are locked. The broadcast architecture is isolated. It cannot be initiated from any source for the next 72 hours. After that, the fragments will self-dissolve. Claire stood at the console and felt the quality of a thing that has been running for a long time coming to a stop. Not relief, something more complicated than relief. The thing that follows relief when you have enough context to know that stopping one thing does not resolve everything the thing was pointing at. The corruption that Strauss had diagnosed was real, even if his treatment was wrong. The broken architecture he had spent 3 years building an alternative to would still be there tomorrow. She looked at the data ring in her hand. The encrypted core inside it was not the fabricated documentation. That had been assembled across the 5 nodes from source material and was now dissolved. The data ring contained the operational record of Glass Citadel itself, 3 years of planning, authorization signatures, communication records, the names of everyone who had touched this project at any level, including the Senate Intelligence Committee chair, who had provided the authorization that made the entire thing possible. That was not nothing. She put the ring in her jacket pocket. She looked at Strauss on the floor. His eyes were open and his breathing was controlled. The expression on his face had settled into something between the composure she had known across 15 years and the weight of the last few minutes. The expression of a man who has come to the end of a very long road and is not certain whether he is glad or not. The letter was the right thing to do, she said again. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She turned and walked toward the corridor. The days after the facility were not clean in the way that resolutions and stories are sometimes clean. No official report placed Claire Novak at the Blue Ridge Mountains location. No report placed her on Flight 717 in any capacity beyond passenger. The federal case that opened in the week following the facility's discovery was built from what the investigating team found inside it from the operational infrastructure and communication architecture that Strauss had constructed over 3 years, from the personnel who were present and who cooperated with varying degrees of willingness once it became clear that cooperation was the only viable option remaining to them. The case was sufficient, not comprehensive. The Senate Intelligence Committee chair, who had provided the black budget authorization, resigned his position 11 days after the facility was secured, citing health reasons in the careful language of a man who has been shown the specific shape of what is coming and has chosen the quieter exit. 4 additional individuals whose names appeared in the communication records were placed under formal review. It was not everything. It was not nothing. The data ring was never submitted into evidence. The chain of custody for it was never formally established. A notice in a small intelligence-adjacent publication reported 6 weeks after the events of that week that a ring recovered at the facility had been found to contain only a wiped core. The encrypted architecture that had once resided in it had been eliminated so completely that no forensic process could reconstruct what it had held. Some analysts concluded it had wiped itself automatically when separated from its owner, a dead man's switch built into the hardware by someone careful enough to anticipate capture. Others believed the wipe was a choice, that someone who had carried a great many things for a great many years had looked at what the ring contained and decided that certain kinds of power, the kind that fits in a small silver band, the kind that names names and assigns guilt and reshapes institutions from the outside, were too specific and too portable to be trusted to any channel, including the ones she had once believed in completely. Neither group could prove their conclusion. Neither group ever found the person they would have needed to ask. Alan Strauss was taken from the facility by federal medical personnel. He was held in a secure medical facility whose location was not public record. He was the official statement said when there was an official statement cooperating with investigators. Claire did not read the official statement. She read the parts that reached public sources, which were few and carefully partial, and she noted what they said and what they did not say and understood the shape of both. She was in Denver when the official statement was released. She had been in Denver for 2 weeks. The container garden on her apartment balcony had mostly died in the 2 weeks she had been absent from it. 3 of the plants were recoverable. She spent an afternoon on that. She found it useful to do things with her hands that had direct and visible results. She did not stay in Denver. She had known sitting in the Blue Ridge Mountains facility waiting for the counter command to complete that she would not stay in Denver. Denver had been a choice that was only possible inside a particular story she had been telling herself about her life, and that story had stopped being available to her the moment a captain in a uniform had walked down the aisle of a commercial aircraft and said a word in her ear. She had been thinking for the 2 weeks since about where a person goes when the story they have been living in ends, but they are still present. She did not have an answer she was comfortable with yet. What she had was a plane ticket. O'Hare International Airport in December looked the way it always looked, which is to say enormous and purposeful, and full of the specific human energy of a place where people are always arriving and always departing, and the institution itself remains constant through all of it. The terminal was dressed for the season lights and decorations installed with the efficient cheerfulness of a large organization doing a human thing at institutional scale. It was warm inside, as airports are always warm inside, regardless of the weather beyond the glass. Claire sat on a bench in the main concourse of Terminal 1. She wore a light gray wool coat she had bought in Denver 2 days before leaving. Her hair was different, darker, closer to its natural color than the shade she had maintained for 6 years. She wore glasses she did not need for vision, but that changed the geometry of her face in the way that simple things can change the geometry of a face when combined with other simple things. She carried a single bag on the floor between her feet. On her lap was the book. She had opened it on the flight from Denver to Chicago. She had read past page 47 for the first time in 6 years. She had read slowly, not because the prose required it, but because she was attending to it in the way you attend to something when you are aware that you have been avoiding it for a long time and are no longer willing to. The book was not, it turned out, primarily about the woman who trusted the wrong person. It was about what she did afterward, what she chose to do with the information that the trust had been wrong and the world was more complicated than she had organized it to be, and she was still regardless present in it. The bookmark was at page 83. She had more to read. Brett Calloway came through the concourse from the direction of the gate check desks in full uniform, pulling a small wheeled bag. He was beginning a shift. He had the stride of a man who had done this walk so many times it required nothing of him, consciously his attention free to move elsewhere. He slowed when he came parallel to her bench. He looked at her. He looked at the book in her hands. He looked at the bookmark's position. Page 83. He did not say anything. He nodded once, the way you nod at someone when words would be less accurate than the nod. Then he picked up his pace again and continued toward the gate concourse, and his uniform disappeared into the movement of the terminal. Claire watched him go. She looked down at the book. Page 83. The protagonist had just made a second decision, different from the first, informed by the cost of the first, in a way that made it more accurate, even though it was no less difficult. The author, Claire thought, understood something real about the relationship between the decisions people make and the decisions those decisions make possible. She turned a page. She heard footsteps slow beside her before she registered the pause. A pilot. Young mid-20s in the white shirt and dark trousers of a first officer, not yet in the full captain's uniform. He had the slightly self-conscious bearing of someone new enough to the job that the uniform still has the quality of a statement rather than a habit. He was pulling a rollaway bag. He had, she realized in the half-second before he spoke, been walking past her bench on a trajectory that would not naturally have brought him this close. He had adjusted his path. He bent toward her slightly. His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone delivering something that had been given to him to deliver without full explanation. Valkyrie, he said. Everything stopped. In the way that it had stopped on the aircraft 6 weeks ago, in the way she understood now that it would always stop when she heard that word, regardless of how long she went between hearings of it, because some things are written too deep in a person to be revised by time or distance or choice. She turned her head. The pilot was already walking away. He did not look back. His rollaway trailed behind him, and the terminal swallowed him the way terminals swallow people into the movement and the noise and the ordinary business of departure. Claire sat with it for a moment. Not the alarm, not the immediate calculation of threat geometry and response options, though all of those things happened in the background, as they always happened. Underneath those things, she sat with something else. Someone had found her again. Someone new, or the continuation of something old, or both. The directive that she had signed herself out of in October of 2019 was either still active in some form she did not have complete visibility into, or it had been reactivated, or someone was using its language for purposes she could not yet evaluate. She did not yet know which. She thought about Alan Strauss on the floor of the control room in Virginia, looking at her with the expression of a man at the end of a long road. She thought about the letter he had written and sent through his own address to a family that had lost someone. She thought about the system he had spent 3 years building an alternative to, and the reason he had built it, and the way the reason was not entirely wrong, even though the alternative was entirely unacceptable. She thought about this fact that she was still here. She thought about the 3 plants on her Denver balcony that had been recoverable. She had spent an afternoon on them. She had not known when she spent that afternoon that she was also spending it on something else. On the decision that was already forming underneath the other decisions, the one that did not announce itself, but that was there when she looked for it, clear and uncomfortable in hers. She closed the book. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, the compact weight of a thing that contains more than its size suggests. Then, she slid it into the outer pocket of her bag. She stood up. She looked at the departures board above the concourse. Her flight was boarding, gate H7. She had been in the boarding line 2 minutes ago before she sat down. She had stepped out of the line because she had needed to sit for a moment. She had needed to be still in the middle of the moving thing before she moved again. She looked at the gate. She looked at the concourse around her, the families with children and the business travelers and the college students and the elderly couple moving slowly toward their gate with the patience of people who have learned that patience is not the opposite of purpose. The ordinary motion of 330 million people going about their lives, none of whom knew how close the thing that told them what to do in emergencies had come to being used against them. She did not walk toward gate H7. She walked in the direction the pilot had gone. She moved the way she had always moved in places where she was trying not to be noticed, which was simply to move like she belonged, because most people pay attention to the things that do not fit, and the thing that fits draws no attention at all. The terminal received her. She became part of its motion. She did not look back at the bench where she had been sitting, or the gate she was not boarding through, or the book in her bag at page 83. She had more to read. She would read it somewhere else. Weeks later, a notice in a small online publication reported that a data ring recovered in connection with an undisclosed federal investigation had been found to be empty. The encrypted core, according to the forensic assessment, had either failed catastrophically or been wiped by a mechanism triggered by its removal from its owner's possession. The report noted that the loss was significant, that without the operational record contained in the ring, certain threads of the federal case would be considerably harder to pursue. The Senate resignation had held. The 4 formal reviews were proceeding. The emergency alert system had been audited, cleared, and returned to full operational status. 330 million people continued to receive their emergency notifications without interruption and without knowing how close those notifications had come to being used as a weapon against them. But the deepest threads, the ones that led furthest back and furthest up, remained loose, remained unprovable, remained protected by the same architecture of institutional legitimacy that had always protected them. Those who speculated about the ring were divided. Some believed that no one with access to the information in that ring would have destroyed it voluntarily, that the self-wipe was a design feature and nothing more. Others believed that a person who had spent 6 years signing herself out of a life and tending a small container garden and reading the same page of the same book might have decided that some power was too specific and too portable to be trusted to any institution, including the one she had spent 15 years serving. The truth was simpler than either position. Claire Novak had made a decision in a facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in the early hours of a November morning. She had made it clearly and at cost, and with the full understanding of what it meant and what it did not resolve. She had looked at what the ring contained, at 3 years of evidence that could reshape institutions and end careers, and confirm what everyone who had lived and worked inside the system had always suspected but never been able to prove, and she had made her choice. Not because the information was not real, not because the people it implicated did not deserve to be implicated, but because the power to determine that, the power to name and to judge and to reshape from the outside, was the same power that Alan Strauss had believed he was using responsibly. And she had looked at what responsible use of that power produced, and she had decided that the answer was not in the ring. The answer was in the work, in the staying, in the fighting of specific failures in specific rooms by specific people who were willing to be accountable for what they did and did not do. It was harder. It was considerably less satisfying. It was the only thing that actually worked. She did not need the case to be clean. She did not need the institutional architecture to acknowledge what had been done. She did not need a flag or a file or a grave in any national cemetery. She needed to read past page 83. She needed to find out what the woman in the book did next after the second decision, after the world had been more complicated than expected and she was still in it, after she had seen the worst a thing could be and chosen carefully and at cost not to become it. The woman from Seat 9A had disappeared into the country she had spent 15 years protecting and 6 years hiding from, and she carried nothing with her that could be traced, and she left nothing behind that could be found. And the terminal at O'Hare continued its motion as it always continued its motion, arrivals and departures in the ordinary, extraordinary business of people moving through the world. Somewhere in it, a woman was reading a book. She was past page 83 now. She was almost at the end, and she was already thinking about what came after.